Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to give you a little brief description of the summary of evidence assignment. This is the second benchmark for the historical investigation, and I kind of have two video clips to share. The first one is just this one slide just to give you an introduction to the summary of evidence, kind of the objectives of the assignment, a little bit of where it fits maybe with the larger historical investigation. And this is kind of a short overview. And then the second video focuses on a student example, just to give you an idea. And I think it's useful just to look at the student example because it helps you see how you might format your HI. And even though there's a video about one student example, I'll include a few student examples for your information so you can, examine them and look at a couple of different ways to do the summary of evidence. So overall, remember that the historical investigation is not necessarily an essay. There's not a place in the HI where you're proposing a thesis where you are pushing a certain point. Oftentimes that's the way we do writing in history. In this case, imagine that the historical investigation would come before you even developed a thesis, and the goal of the HI is actually to develop a thesis statement. So you propose a question that you don't know the answer to. You examine a few different arguments in order to decide which argument is the strongest, and then you draw a conclusion, which is kind of like a thesis statement. The example I can kind of use is that if you imagine the topic we were talking about in class, to what extent was religious piety a cause of the First Crusades? That's a question that is not a thesis statement, just a question, but assume that you're interested in answering that question. You might go through a process of having to research that question and pull together a summary of evidence that would help you assess the answer to that question. So to what extent was religious piety the cause of the First Crusades? We could organize some research evidence kind of in the category that this might be the case. It might be that religious piety was actually a cause of the First Crusade, and pieces of evidence that might support that might include individual crusaders who actually were interested in gaining access to heaven through accessing an indulgence. Maybe there were individuals who really felt as if their religious goals would be met, if they were being better Christians and good Christians, and if even whether that wasn't the case, if it was their belief that that was the case, maybe they were motivated by religious piety. So there's some pieces of evidence that students even noted in class that would clearly fit in an argument that yes, religious piety was a cause of the First Crusade. Okay. However, there might also be some counter evidence to suggest that there were other motivations that were important, and some of this evidence could be organized, say, in a category to suggest that maybe Pope Urban, who perhaps from the European perspective called the First Crusade, perhaps, that he had additional, ulterior motives. And maybe while he suggests that the causes are religious in nature, perhaps he was looking for greater papal power. There might be some historical context about the role of the Pope in this time period and the role of Pope Urban in particular that you could use to suggest that there was at least a possibility that he had ulterior motives. You can also use different versions of his speech at Clermont in 1095, using the primary source itself to suggest that, through use of language, he was perhaps, trying to suggest one, cause for the crusade, but maybe using some historical context or some, information about his activity before the speech. Maybe he was really just trying to increase his power by connecting with the Byzantine Empire. Maybe he was trying to accelerate the role of the Catholic Church, in relation to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Some of that could perhaps have been some of his goals, and you could make that case. You might also have a whole category of your summary of evidence that focuses on crusaders who were motivated by, selfish reasons in order to, they felt guilty about some of their knighthood activities and they wanted to access this indulgence. And so they go off, and you can argue in your analysis later that it was a selfish reason, but the evidence evidence would have to be included in the summary of evidence. The other thing might be that there was materialistic gain, or some people wanted revenge, or kind of mistreated Jews or committed genocide against Jews, and some of that violence might have been part of some other type of motivation that was about an insecurity and about us versus them. So the summary of evidence can include a variety of these different categories. Think in terms of taking some of the evidence that you guys were talking about in class and organizing it so that it supports maybe 2 to 3 different claims, okay? And then, the task of the HI is to evaluate this evidence, okay? The summary of evidence is all about collecting the evidence and putting it forth. So if you look at the slide that you have in front of you, the summary of evidence is going to be about 2 pages, single-spaced, okay? So it's not lengthy. It's not 20 pages of evidence. It's tight, okay? It includes just information from sources. There's nothing in this that is in your voice, okay? You're either going to be paraphrasing from a source or you are going to be directly quoting from a source, okay? The summary of evidence includes all of the evidence that will help you draw conclusions, okay? So if you later on want to kind of discuss the question about the Crusades, you have to draw on certain evidence that has to be in your summary of evidence, okay? So, you might later on add or take away evidence from your summary of evidence, okay? But it's like the box of evidence that all of your later conclusions come from, okay? Later sections, including an analysis section, will give you a chance to interpret the evidence. Again, this section, the summary of evidence, does not include your voice, what you think about the evidence, what the evidence means in terms of your question. That is later. This is just literally the evidence, kind of like straight in front of you, so it's set up for you to use later on. The summary of evidence includes information from your sources, paraphrased, and it can be bulleted. There is actually an interest in keeping your evidence tight and short, so you don't want to include a lot of background information that's not necessary. Might be important, background information might be included, historical context that's key to understanding your question might be included, or used in your analysis might be included, but bulleted information should be brief, okay? You would be not summarizing all of the Mackay text, for example. You would be picking out arguments where Mackay addressed religious piety was definitely a cause of the Crusades. Or if Pope Urban had ulterior motives and you had a sentence or two from a source, that's what you'd be using. The evidence also has to be cited. So evidence that you take from the Mackay text is there's a parentheses at the end of each bulleted piece of evidence, and you would put Mackay, the title of the source, and the page number, because then your reader of the summary of evidence is seeing that you're not getting all of your pieces of evidence just from Mackay. There were all these other readings that you guys used in your discussion about the religious piety question. You would then use those various different sources, okay? So every piece of evidence that kind of gets put next to each other has perhaps a different source. Your goal is to use all 8 of your sources. The evidence should offer multiple answers to your HI question. So again, the evidence should kind of be categorized so that it supports different claims, okay? So the first category might be evidence that supports religious piety was a motivation, or you might just list it as religious piety was a motivation, and then multiple pieces of evidence that make that case. Then your next category might be Pope Urban's ulterior motives. Boom. And then there might be some evidence that suggests Pope Urban had ulterior motives. You can also use Pope Urban evidence under the category for religious piety. And then a third category might include, some crusaders were motivated by materialistic gain. And there might be some particular evidence that some crusaders who were peasants perhaps were looking for, additional income, or some, people who were, perhaps not granted land as part of the, English, aristocracy were seeking some sort of, better lot in life and ended up going on the crusade. So kind of look at how you can couch your evidence. That's going to be very, very much connected to this part of the assignment, okay? And I'm going to end it there just so you can use some of this information, and then the next video clip will just give you a short version of a student's historical investigation about a question that's different than the Crusades question. Okie doke, have a good rest of the day.